Friends and viewers, a very beautiful war story, the name of which is All Quiet on the Western Front, written by Eric Maria Remarque. So this is the story of the World War I. All Quiet on the Western Front is narrated by Paul Boomer, protagonist, the hero of this novel. Paul Boomer, a young man of 19 who fights in the German army on the French front in World War I. Paul and several of his friends from school joined the army volunteer after listening to the stirring patriotic speech of their teacher, Ken Torek. But after experiencing 10 weeks of the brutal training at the hands of the petty, cruel corporal Himmeltos and the unimaginable brutality of life on the front, Paul and his friends have realized that the ideals of nationalism and patriotism for which they enlisted are simple empty cliches. They no longer believe that war is glorious or honorable, and they live in a constant physical terror. When Paul's company receives a short reprieve after 2 weeks of fighting, only 80 men of the original 150-man company return from the front. The cook doesn't want to give the survivor the rations they were meant for the dead man, but eventually agrees to do so. The man thus enjoy a large meal. Paul and his friend visit Kamerich, a former classmate who has recently had a leg amputated after contracting gangrene. Kamerich is slowly dying, and Muller, another former classmate, wants Kamerich boots for himself. Paul doesn't consider Muller's insensitive like the other soldier. Muller simply realized pragmatically that Kamerich no longer needs his boots. Surviving the agony of war, Paul forces one to learn to disconnect oneself from emotions like grief, sympathy, and fear. Not long after this encounter, Paul returns to Kamerich's bedside just as the young man dies. At Kamerich's request, Paul takes his boots to Muller. A group of new recruits comes to reinforce the company, and Paul's friend Kat produce a beef and bean stew that impresses them. Kat says that if all men in an army, including the officer, were paid the same wage and given the same food, wars would be over immediately. Krupp, another of Paul's former classmates, says that there should be no armies. He argues that the nation's leaders should instead fight out their disagreement with clubs with each other. They discuss the fact that petty, insignificant people become powerful and arrogant during war. Jedin, a member of Paul's company, announced that the cruel corporal Himmeltos has come to fight at the front. At night, the men go on a harrowing mission to lay barbed wire at the front. Pounded by artillery, they hide in a graveyard where the force of the shelling causes the buried corpses to emerge from their graves as group of living men fall dead around them. After this gruesome event, the surviving soldiers return to their camp where they kill lice and think about what they will do at the end of the war. Some of the men have tentative plans, but all of them seem to feel that the war will never end. Paul fears that if the war did end, he wouldn't know what to do with himself. Hamilists arrive at the front. When the men see him, Jordan insult him. The man lieutenant gives them light punishment, but also lectures Hamiltus about the futility of saluting at the front. Paul and Kat find a house with a goose and roast the goose from supper, enjoying a rare good meal. The company is caught in a bloody battle with charging group of elite infantrymen. Men are blown apart, limbs are severed from torsos, and giant rat pick at the dead and wounded. Paul feels that he must become an animal in battle, trusting only his instinct to keep him alive. After the battle, only 32 of 80 men are still alive. The men are given a short reprieve at a field depot. Paul and some of his friends go for a swim, which ends in rendezvous with a group of French girls. Paul desperately wishes to recapture his innocence with the girl, but he feels that it is impossible to do so. Paul receives 70 days of leave and goes home to see his family. He feels awkward and oppressed in his hometown, unable to discuss his traumatic experiences with anyone. He learns that his mother is dying of cancer and that Cantoric has been conscripted as a soldier, from which he derives a certain cold satisfaction. He visits Cameric's mother and tells her untruthfully that her son's death was instant and painless. At the end of his leave, Paul spent some time at a training camp near a group of Russian prisoners of war. Paul feels that Russians are people just like him, but not subhuman enemies, and wonder how war can make enemies of people who have no grudge against one another. Paul is sent back to his company and is reunited with his friend. The Kaiser, the German emperor, pays a visit to the front, and the men are disappointed to see that he is merely a short man with a weak voice. In battle, Paul is separated from his company and forced to hide in a shell hole. A French soldier jumps into the shell hole with him, and Paul instinctively stabs him. As a man dies a slow, painful death, Paul is overcome with remorse for having hurt him. He feels again that this enemy soldier is no enemy at all, but rather a victim of war just like himself. Paul looks through the soldier things and finds that his name was Gerard Duval, and learns the Duval and wife and a child at home. When he returned to his company, Paul recounts the incident to his friend, who tried to console him. Paul and his friends are given an easy assignment for 3 weeks. They are to guard a supply depot away from the fighting. When the next battle takes place, Paul and Krupp are wounded and forced to bribe a sergeant major with a cigar in order to place on the hospital train together. At the hospital, Paul undergoes surgery. Krupp's leg is amputated and he becomes extremely depressed. After his surgery, Paul has a short leave at home before he returned to his company. As the German army began to give in to the unrelenting pressure of the Allied forces, Paul's friends are killed in combat one by one. Deterring one, Paul's close friend attempts to desert but is caught and court-martialed. Cat is killed when a piece of sharpener slices his head open while Paul is carrying him to safety. By the fall of 1918, Paul is the only one of the circle of friends who is still alive. Soldiers everywhere whisper that the German will soon surrender and that peace will come. Paul is poisoned in a gas attack and given a short leave. He reflects that when the war ends, he will be ruined for peacetime. All he knows is the war. In the October of 1918, on a day with very little fighting, Paul is killed. The army reports for that day reads simply, all quiet on the Western Front. Paul's corpses wear a calm expression, as though relieved that the end has come at last. So this is the painful story of war and the consequences from which our hero, the protagonist, Paul, had suffered lastly by the war. So, friends and viewers, the theme of this story is the horror of war. The overriding theme of All Quiet on the Western Front is the terrible brutality of war, which informs every scene in the novel. Whereas war novels before All Quiet on the Western Front tended to romanticize what war was like, emphasizing ideas such as glory, honor, patriotic duty, and adventure. All Quiet on the Western Front set out to portray war as it was actually experienced, replacing the romantic picture of glory and heroism with a decidedly unromantic vision of fear, meaninglessness, and butchery in many ways. So, the effect of war on the soldier, how the war had affected the soldier on the front, and the nationalism and political power. In many ways, the participating cause of World War I was the ethic of nationalism, the idea that competing nation-state were a fundamental part of existence. The one owed one first loyalty to one's nation, the nation's identity. These are the themes involved in this remarkable book, All Quiet on the Western Front. Thank you very much for patient listening.